Well, hello, everybody. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Hello, midday people on the East Coast and in between. We are very grateful and appreciative that you are here today. It is grandmother's pleasure to welcome the fourth professor in our Back to School series, and that is Adzi Vokhiwa, who is coming to us today from an organization that you will, I think, love hearing about and getting to know, Community Justice. Adzi is the Vice President of Public Policy for Community Justice. She came to Community Justice from her position as the Director of Federal Affairs for the Giffords organization. When she was at Gifford, was it the Hill or Roll Call? I think it was the Hill who identified her as one of the top lobbyists working with the Hill. And having worked there myself, I can tell you that lobbyists are incredibly valuable and instrumental to getting our work done. So I congratulate you, Atsi. This is our fourth back to school session. Our first one was on the arts, how the arts can be a tool in gun violence prevention and raising awareness of gun violence. Our second was on the role of grandmothers globally. Many nations around the world, grandmothers are a rising force, a rising influence. Our third was, and I think David may be with us today, was David Reedman, who spoke to us about school shootings and is probably the most knowledgeable person in the country on the school shootings, both the who's at risk, what tends to happen, the impact, and what could be done as prevention. So my name is Margie Heldring, and I am the principal founder and executive director of Grandmothers for Gun Responsibility. We have a few members of our advisory council here with us today: Linda Zug from Massachusetts, Trudy Inslee from Washington State, Dorothy Mann from Washington State. I want to welcome my sister, who is I see here today, which is really nice. And we have Maureen Frisch, who is a member of our communications committee, served on the board of the Washington State Grandmothers Group that is sunsetting now, and we're kind of the spin-off of that group of origin. Kay Bicey, who works very hard on the Grandmothers Foundation, which raises money to support research into gun violence. And then I'd like to introduce our two staff members to you. One is Liana Redman. Liana waves. She is the Director of Operations. And Sophie Garner, back on. Sophie is in Maine working on ERPO, hoping to bring across a victory next Tuesday on ERPO. So we are thrilled with these back to school experiences. With everyone's permission, we record these and we distribute them to our members all over the country, which, by the way, is now 39 states and the District of Columbia, growing all the time. And we conduct these because it is our belief that the more we learn about gun violence, its causes, its risk factors, its preventions, its remedies, the more comfortable and confident we are as advocates. And we can engage deeper and more fully in the search for solutions in this country. So Community Justice is an organization I've known about for several years, have great admiration for. Its focus is on Black and Brown communities, where I hope I'm not borrowing your words, Adzi, that you were planning to use, but I love the phrase I saw on your website, where there are people closest to the pain of gun violence. And it's so important for us to come together on this problem. And it is therefore a great honor to welcome you, Adzi, and please, everybody put questions that you might have in the chat box. It's easier for us, and we will get to them at the end for sure. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about this problem in these busy, tumultuous days and being engaged in our movement. So, Adzi.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm excited that I get to tell my dad someone called me a professor. He always wanted me to get a PhD, but I don't quite have the patience for that. So, I
Today you are a professor.
appreciate Yes, I can take that back home with me. I have some slides to share. Let me get those up. Um, okay, hopefully you all will be able to see the slides. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'll just tell you a little bit more about community justice before getting into the presentation. I serve as the Vice President of Policy at Community Justice, and our focus is really on the unique impact of gun violence in Black and Brown communities and uplifting the solutions to gun violence that have come from those communities. We were founded 9 years ago by a woman named Amber Goodwin, and we focus our work really in the policy and advocacy space at the national level and also in several states and cities and counties across the country. We're working in about 20 states right now. Um, and so when we talk about something like community violence intervention, it is a core policy priority for us when we think about how we address gun violence, especially in the way that it shows up in Black and Brown communities. I want to talk a little bit about how we think about this issue, how we think about the solutions to gun violence, and then just kind of give an update on where we are at the federal level with community violence intervention. So, at the core of our work at Community Justice, we think about approaching gun violence as a public health issue. And we know that this is something that has, really caught on and become more recognized. Last year, a former Surgeon General issued a really helpful report talking about how gun violence is a public health issue. And I just have a quote there from a partner that we work with at Cities United, who is part of our policy council. And, this is really thinking about the fact that, gun violence is a public health crisis, right? And we need to treat it as such. We need to think about how do we prevent, how do we reduce the spread, and then how do we eventually eradicate gun violence? And so thinking about it from a multifaceted approach and all the different ways that we can, improve protective factors in communities and also reduce risk factors for gun violence. I really like this quote from Jonathan because I feel like it just really sums up the philosophy of our organization very well. So when we talk about community violence intervention is work that has gone on for decades. It was, named other things. The term CVI is fairly new, but the idea is that there are community-led and community-based evidence-informed strategies that focus on engaging with the individuals and groups in a community that are at a high risk of either experiencing or even perpetuating violence. And again, thinking about violence as a communicable disease, how do we prevent it from spreading? There are several different types of CVI programs. I've listed just a few examples there. There are outreach-based violence intervention programs, and these are people who are credible messengers who have connections in communities who, are aware of who may be involved in or victimized by violence. And their work is really in conflict resolution and mediation. For an example, let's say a shooting happens and a person's brother, cousin, friend is shot. An outreach-based violence intervention worker will go to, the relatives, the known associates of that person who was victimized and encourage them to resolve the conflict so that there's not acts of retaliation that further perpetuate violence. So that's just one example. But again, it's literally being out in the street, in the community when things flare up, when there's a potential for violence, engaging with the people involved to prevent those conflicts from escalating into shootings. There are hospital-based programs that engage people after they've been victimized by violence. Again, trying to encourage people not to retaliate, and also offering them services. So, after you've been shot, of course, you have immediate medical needs, but thinking about, what are the reasons why a person may have gotten to this place, and trying to connect them with services while they're in that hospital setting. Um, Cognitive behavioral therapy and mentorship is something that it has really, really taken off. And again, it's trying to essentially retrain people's mindset and their thought process about violence and how they engage with conflict and mediate conflicts. So, especially for people who may have previously been involved in violence, having them serve as mentors and leaders and saying, hey, I used to be engaged in this work. Here are some of the techniques and tools and training that have helped me shift my mindset to not engage in violence anymore. And then another one that I think doesn't get as much attention is thinking about victim and survivor services. We know that one of the highest predictors of someone perpetuating violence is previously experiencing violence. So when we provide support to victims and survivors, that can help them turn away from violence. And we also know that there are a lot of reasons why someone may become a victim of violence. And there's all sorts of risk factors, which I'll talk a bit more about, but thinking about things like, housing instability, about, job instability, lack of food, all of that. So thinking about what are those services that a person who has been victimized by violence may need. And, all of those, providing those services and supports to people in, what is arguably the most vulnerable time of their life can help them, not to be further involved in violence. So the key part of all this is people who are credible messengers, people who have the respect of their community, who know what's going on in the community and can engage those people who are most at risk. As much as people may have good intentions, when you walk into a community or a stranger, people don't trust you, right? And it really takes that level of trust and knowing each other in order to really help intervene in conflicts and prevent them from escalating. So that's just a quick overview of what we consider community violence intervention. And for us, CVI is just one part of how we comprehensively reduce gun violence. So violence intervention programs are key, and a big part of our work at Community Justice is advocating for resources for CVI. Really, before I would say 2021, at the federal level, we didn't see significant investment in CVI, and I'll talk more about how that has changed. But at the federal, state, and local level, making sure that this work is really seen as an essential part of the public safety ecosystem, as a complement to law enforcement. When you talk to a lot of law enforcement officers, they will tell you, while they don't necessarily work hand in hand with CVI organizations, there's a recognition there and almost a professional respect that there is work that CVI organizations can do that law enforcement simply can't. Law enforcement oftentimes is very reactive. And, knowing that, especially in Black and Brown communities, there's a history of I guess the nicest way I can say it is challenges when it comes to policing. Oftentimes law enforcement is just not well equipped to do that, direct one-on-one engagement that can help prevent conflicts from happening in the first place. So we advocate for violence intervention to be, a resourced and recognized part of the public safety ecosystem in communities. We also have to think about what are the risk factors for gun violence. Previously being a victim of gun violence, as I said, and some of the other factors around economic instability can also be a risk factor for gun violence. We also have to support public policy that addresses those root causes of violence. And one of the things that the Biden administration did in 2021 when they were thinking about, how do we resource community violence intervention. And this was before any new law had passed, as they looked at various existing grant programs throughout the federal government. And they made violence intervention work eligible for a lot of those different grants. So these were grants under, for example, the Department of Labor. So thinking about having youth having access to workforce training programs, because having a good paying job helps to prevent people from engaging in violence or other kinds of crime. There were grants that were made available under the Department of Housing and Urban Development because, housing insecurity, unsafe housing is also, a root cause and a risk factor. So thinking about, not just what was under the umbrella of the Department of Justice, but, holistically across the federal government, where are there issues that have an intersection with some of these root causes of violence, where people who are doing work in the community to address those issues and help to reduce violence, could or should be eligible for funding. Um, so as we all know, we have a real problem when it comes to gun violence and young people. I know you hear this basically in every meeting. We all know guns are the number one killer of youth 19 and under, which is absolutely shameful, to be saying that in the year 2025. So we have to think about, engaging with young people who are both at risk of being involved in violence, but also dealing with the trauma of things like active shooter drills, or the threats of shootings in schools. That trauma is another thing that can really impact people negatively and cause them to be involved in violence or to think that they need a gun to protect themselves. Just adverse childhood experiences are really um, really concerning and something that we have to address. And so, we support thinking about how we bring, intervention programs as well as mental health supports to young people who are dealing with, the threat of gun violence in a way that, previous generations really didn't have to. I'm 37 years old, and I can say I remember doing tornado drills in schools, but we never had active shooter drills. Gun violence just didn't show up in the ways that I think it does for many young people today. Um, so intimate partner violence and gun violence are, unfortunately very, very connected. And so, we think about how we can address that. We know sometimes intimate partner violence can spill out into the communities. And so there's a connection there with community violence. But we also know for women in particular that, a gun in an intimate partner, in a violent situation involving an intimate partner makes it so much more deadly for a woman. I think that statistics would probably all point to is that if a gun is in domestic violence situation, it's 5 times more likely to result in the death of a woman. And so that's something that we really have to address. And then, of course, we have to think about our firearm laws and regulations. I'm sure this is something that you all work on in your respective states. I heard there was work on an ERPO campaign in Maine. We have to think about limiting access to firearms for people who have a history of dangerousness or, demonstrating violence. We know that our gun laws are far, far too loose, and that is a huge contributor to our gun violence crisis in this country. And then lastly, we don't, as much as we know that, gun violence is an incredible, massive problem in our country, we have, lots of facts and statistics that we can point to. We still need more. We need to know more about the data around gun violence. We need to make sure that crimes are being reported in an accurate way and that we have that information so that we can really approach this issue in a targeted way. We may think we know what gun violence looks like in a particular community, but without that data, that how it's actually showing up, we may end up implementing a wrong approach. And so all of this has to be data-driven, evidence-based, evidence-informed, and we need, accurate crime reporting and fair and equitable data practices and policies so that we are elevating the most effective policy solutions. So before I get into the federal part, one of the things I wanted to talk about is just how CVI looks like at the state and local level. So, there have been some cities across the country who, for a long time, have invested in CVI work, some cities and states. So, Boston is often an example. They were doing really great work, even 30 years ago that led to significant reductions. Okay, I see you have at least one Bostonian here. Um, two that led to really significant reductions in gun violence. And so there were some cities who were trying innovative approaches, providing resources. And, a lot of what they saw was that when they invested, say $1 in a community violence intervention program, that there was often a return of $7. Um, in that investment, meaning that was less money that was being spent on medical costs for victims. There was less money that was being spent by law enforcement to investigate crimes and in the court system prosecuting crimes. So, cities started to pick up on the fact that when they made these investments, not only did it save lives, but it also benefited them from, a fiscal and economic standpoint. So, this really kind of exploded, I would say, in 2021 with the passage of the American Rescue Plan Act. That included billions of dollars for public safety. Not all of that money went to CVI, of course. There was a lot of cities and states that invested in their police departments and other aspects of public safety, but it really led to the expansion of things like local offices of violence prevention that help to coordinate efforts, as well as direct funding to the CVI ecosystem and programs. And for all of those cities who made those intentional investments, we're seeing it generally pay off. Like some places have seen as high as 30 to 50% reductions in violence and in homicides since those investments really ramped up in 2021 with the passage of ARPA. And I list a few of them there. I think Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm biased, I live in Maryland, but Baltimore, Maryland is a really great example. And the mayor is very upfront about this. He has an Office of Violence Prevention and talks very proudly about what they have been able to achieve by investing in CVI, by having targeted partnerships with law enforcement and really implementing this comprehensive strategy. Like Baltimore has seen just huge, huge reductions in violence. And that's what we've seen in many jurisdictions across the country that have made similar investments. At Community Justice, we released an annual report called the Violence Prevention Index, the VPI. We recently released our 2024 edition looking at the calendar year of 2024. And with that report, we assess 100 US cities that had the highest incident of gun violence in 2021 and 2022. 2022 is when we launched the report. And there's a number of criteria that we assess, and it's really an examination of how cities are creating infrastructure around violence intervention. So, are they doing things like directly investing in violence intervention? Are they, if they're able to, strengthening their local gun laws? Are they investing in youth targeted programs? So, there's 35 different criteria across three categories. And what we've seen is since 2022, when we did the first report, there has continued to be a steady increase in cities, making these investments and expanding their infrastructure. But there is a lot more work to do at the local level, and especially as we're thinking about what the federal landscape is, it's more important than ever that our states and our cities are stepping up and doing their part to support violence intervention and gun violence prevention. So now we'll shift to the federal level. So again, as I said earlier, up until really the last 5 years, we didn't see very significant federal investments specifically in CVI. I mentioned the American Rescue Plan Act. which, did a whole host of things, including that investment in public safety. But the very first time we actually had a federal grant program that was specifically focused on CVI was in 2022 with the creation of the Community-Based Violence Intervention and Prevention Initiative. So that's housed in the Department of Justice and the Office of Justice Programs. It was created in 2022 through the omnibus federal spending bill, the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And in the report language accompanying that bill, Congress said, we're providing $50 million this initial $50 million in CVIPI with the intention of building out and supporting community-based efforts to address violence, to intervene and both prevent. So they made very clear that that was their intention with this grant program. So it got an initial $50 million in fiscal year 2022, and then the same amount of funding in fiscal year 23 and 24. So a total of $150 million through the regular congressional appropriation package. As you all know, in 2022, Congress passed the first federal gun law in almost 3 decades, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And that bill passed just a few months after Congress initially created the CVIPI program. And through the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, that program received $250 million over 5 years, so $50 million per year starting in fiscal year 2022. So for fiscal years 2022, 23, and 24, the CVIPI program received $100 million total, $50 million from Congress, $50 million from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And again, prior to this, we have essentially zero, right? That's solely dedicated to CVI. So this is a huge investment and a huge increase and really significant. Another thing that we saw through Congress was the return of earmarks, which had stopped being a thing for a few years. But we've seen in fiscal years 23 and 24 that over $68 million was allocated to CVI projects through the earmark process. And at Community Justice, this is something we really advocate for our community-based organizations to apply for through their members of Congress. This is a process that is much less cumbersome than, the federal grant process, and these tend to be smaller amounts of funding than what's awarded through CVIPI, but can often be more accessible. And again, $68 million is not a small amount of money to help support, the field that, where organizations often run on tiny shoestring kind of budgets. So when we started the year in January 2025, this was the landscape. We had a grant program in the Department of Justice solely devoted to CVI. We had Congress and members of Congress who were directly advocating for organizations in their communities through the earmark program. So, things were good. And now comes the depressing part of the presentation, walking through what we've seen since January 20th. So, I think just to summarize, and I'll go through some of these more specifically, we've seen a really significant shift in approaches to gun violence prevention and crime from this administration. I don't think that's news to any of you all. But what I want to highlight here is kind of how we've systematically tried to see the removal or prevention of funding going to community-based work, as well as kind of clear declarations of changes in strategy and priority when it comes to approaches to crime and gun violence. So the first thing that I'll highlight is that on day one, we saw a lot of Biden era and initiatives and executive orders rescinding. That's very common when there's a transition in power. One of the ones that got a lot of attention was the DEI related executive order. And a lot of what was reported in the media at the time was related to personnel in the federal government, how so many of those, diversity, equity, and inclusion positions and initiatives were eliminated or ended. But that executive order also included specific language directing all of the federal agencies to take a look at their grant making and make sure that they were not prioritizing quote unquote illegal DEI. We also saw the closure of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, which was, a historic milestone when that office was created in September of 2023. They did incredible work to implement the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, as well as, solicit input from so many stakeholders who are impacted by this issue at all levels of government, and also standing up an incredible, FEMA-like response to support communities impacted by violence. A month into the job, they did that in Lewiston, Maine, when there was that horrific mass shooting, not just having a Department of Justice response with an investigation, but pulling in support from multiple agencies to help the community there that had been impacted. So, the closure of that office was a real loss, which, I know we all feel very sad about. Um, just a week later, we saw kind of the first attempt from the administration to start clawing back funding from things that they don't agree with. They announced a pause on the distribution of federal grants, loans, and other funding. And that pause was ultimately unpaused, I guess, by a lawsuit, by several lawsuits that were filed by nonprofit organizations and other folks that were impacted. But that was again their opening maneuver when it came to trying to remove this funding. Um, Another thing that this administration has done, of course, we all heard about Doge and saw the devastation that they wreaked in the federal government. When we think about gun violence prevention, there are direct attacks on the Department of Education as well as the Department of Justice have had a huge impact. In the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, there was $1 billion that was allocated to the Department of Education to support youth-based violence prevention work, as well as the hiring of mental health professionals in schools to support children who, may be traumatized or impacted by violence or, other issues. And, with the order to begin dismantling the Department of Education, the distribution of those funds, and those efforts started to go away. Um, the Department of Justice hasn't yet implemented any of this restructuring, but in their memo, they discussed plans to combine all of their grant making offices. So, shrinking the amount of funding available, as well as making all of these different priorities compete against each other. So, in the memo, they described combining like the Office of Violence Against Women, the Office for Victims of Crime, the COPS office, the community-oriented policing services, and a whole host of other grant-making offices. So again, making those issues and those priorities compete against each other with a smaller pool of funding. And then we saw the first kind of hints of, something that we're seeing right now with this executive order that was focused on DC, this narrative coming from the administration that crime is out of control and the federal government has to step in to address it. So we saw them talk about, things like maximum enforcement of immigration law, and I think we've all seen how unfortunately, that is playing out in a number of cities. And they also talked about speeding up the processing of concealed carry license applications. I'm sure concealed carry and unpermitted carry is something that many of you all have worked on in your states because that's really been those efforts have really been ramping up by the gun. I hate to call them gun rights folks. The Second Amendment extremist folks out there. And so, DC, of course, is a place that has very strong gun laws. And, it's very hard to get a concealed carry license in the District of Columbia. So trying to start, eradicating and weakening DC's gun laws. So that's quarter one. Hang on with me. It's not going to get any better. So in Q2, we really saw a lot targeting CVI more specifically. We know the Department of Health and Human Services was absolutely gutted. So many things and departments and initiatives eliminated to just, devastating effect. We know that the staff at the CDC who was working on violence prevention, many of them also lost their jobs, and the CDC isn't just hasn't just been responsible for studying and researching violence, but they also were giving out grants for different violence prevention initiatives, and so those grant programs were threatened and potentially eliminated. Later in April, we saw that many grant programs, specifically grant awards that went to primarily community-based organizations, were abruptly terminated on the basis that they no longer effectuated the priorities of DOJ. Um, and, in the community-based violence intervention prevention initiative, we had seen that grant funding go to community-based organizations, but as well as state governments, local governments, and then there was specific funding for technical assistance to help, with the expansion of CVI work. And we saw them target only the community-based programs. So the funding to government entities remained intact, and that's relevant a little bit later on. And then again in April, we saw an executive order focused on strengthening law enforcement. And I just have to state for the record here, we are not an organization that opposes law enforcement or, advocates for defunding law enforcement, despite what some may claim. But we are concerned that in this executive order, there was language around providing greater legal protections for law enforcement who may violate the law. We know that unfortunately there are police involved in shootings. That is a reality, especially for folks in the Black and Brown community. And as there have been efforts over the last several years to hold bad police accountable, this executive order flies in the face of that. There was also a directive to the Federal Bureau of Prisons to maximize capacity, which is really just a dangerous kind of statement. So again, as we've moved from this administration that focused on prevention and intervention, non-carceral approaches to violence reduction and crime prevention, instead now we have the administration saying, well, just get ready to lock people up and make sure we have the spaces for them, right? So very concerning from us when we took a look at that executive order. All right, Q3. We saw some more creative approaches. I use the term creative derisively here, just to be clear. Some more creative approaches from the federal government in terms of thinking about how they can remove funding from, this public health approach to gun violence. So, back in March, Congress passed the latest round of funding for the duration of fiscal year 2025. So that funding lasted from March 14th through September 30th of this year. And the Office of Management and Budget in July began saying, even though there was funding appropriated for this work, that the CDC could not spend any of their congressionally appropriated, signed into law funding on things like adverse childhood experiences. So, examining the impact of violence and other traumatizing events in childhood, firearm violence prevention research, youth violence prevention, and even things like their injury control research centers. So they made that announcement and they tried to block the funding. Fortunately, members of Congress were made aware of this and they pushed back on OMB and were able to get those funds reinstated. But again, we just see yet another attempt from the federal government to stop funding, even lawfully, legally appropriated funding, from being spent on things that they don't agree with. We saw an executive order in August related to improving the oversight of federal grant making, and this is one that I think didn't get a lot of attention at the time. Basically, that executive order said that federal grants should only go to programs and initiatives that fit with the president's policy priorities. There was specific language around grants related to quote gender ideology or racial ideology like no longer being permitted. So yet another way of them trying to restrict funding. Just to speak plainly, when we think about something like community violence intervention, it is work that often originated in communities of color that is done by people of color, supporting people of color. So when we have explicit language from the federal government essentially saying, if you name that, we're not going to give you federal grants, that's very, very concerning. Um, Also in August, as we're all aware, we saw a crime emergency declared in DC, the deployment of the National Guard as well as federal law enforcement in DC really become a testing ground for what we're seeing happening in so many cities here. And again, this is building on the narrative starting back in March that, all of these Democrat-led cities are just riddled with crime and it's out of control. And we've had all of these soft on crime policies. And so now we have to get in there with the military to, enforce the law and prevent crime from happening. And we know that this is not only incredibly ineffective, right? The military is not trained in law enforcement and policing in neighborhoods. That's not their purpose. They serve a very important and specific purpose, and that's not what it is. So we know that it's ineffective if we think about, them trying to make them an extension of the police force, but also it's incredibly expensive. I know we all heard the statistic, like to the tunes of millions of dollars a day having the National Guard deployed in DC. And if we just think about, spending a single day of funding that went towards the deployment of the National Guard, what that could do for the community violence intervention community in DC or in so many places, it's an outrageous waste of taxpayer dollars and a very ineffective one. Um, Last thing I will highlight here before shifting to talk about Congress is that in September, we saw the Department of Justice announce notice of funding opportunities for several grant programs. And I'll just talk about CVIPI specifically. So with CVIPI, there were a number of changes made. So, the notice of funding opportunity, um, if you haven't read through them before, they talk about what the agency will prioritize when they consider applications for this grant. So for CVIPI, there were several changes made. First and foremost, community-based organizations were no longer eligible to apply directly for funding. That's a huge, huge blow, especially for this one grant program that was supposed to be dedicated to supporting the expansion of community-based and community-led work. There was real changes in the agency priorities as far as prioritizing law enforcement efforts to prevent violent crime. And again, we are not against law enforcement, but if you look at the Department of Justice, there are a whole host of grant programs that support law enforcement and their work. And so it was a real slap in the face to have, this particular grant program essentially to have them say that they essentially wanted to redirect it to law enforcement. Um, and another thing about the purpose that I'll flag is that rather than have these grants focused on the communities that experience the highest rates of gun violence and targeting the individuals at highest risk of being victimized or being involved in gun violence, it was just kind of blanket, we support law enforcement efforts. And again, like the whole point of community-based work is that it is targeted. It's a small percentage of a community that tends to be involved in violence. So having these kind of broad programs that are not targeted are not going to be as impactful. And then the last thing I'll say about this notice of funding opportunity is that there was explicit language saying that any grantees must sign a certificate on penalty of perjury, saying that they will cooperate with immigration law enforcement. And so that's also really dangerous, especially for CVI groups that may work with people of mixed immigration status, saying that you have to turn over to federal law enforcement any information about people's immigration status is very concerning. Um, So just to talk about the impact of the administration actions and kind of where we are with CVI. So when those grant termination happened, there were about 145 CVI grants that had been funded. 69 of those were terminated. That was a loss to the field of about $158 million, which is really, really devastating. Um, with the invasion of federal law enforcement, ICE, and the National Guard, it's made it difficult for CVI organizations to do their work. It's made it hard for them to be out in the community engaging with people. Some CVI organizations have had to sort of, become kind of rapid response entities and trying to support communities who may be impacted by federal law enforcement and ICE and just all of this. So, kind of shifting their focus and their mission because, their neighborhoods are being impacted in a different way. As I said, we no longer see community-based organizations eligible for CVIPI funding, which is a huge and devastating blow. And, at least at the federal level, we're seeing that community-led efforts and programs are really being systematically cut out in favor of, this heavy law enforcement and even militarization in communities. And, in the long term, it's incredibly expensive and it's also incredibly ineffective. So, it remains to be seen what the data will tell us about this year. As much as, some in Congress and in the administration are trying to claim that this new approach is reducing crime. We'll have to see what it ultimately means. It's unsustainable from a resource standpoint, and it's just not an effective long-term solution. So we'll have to see what the data shows us as far as the impact this has and whether it disrupts the downward trend in homicides and violence that we had seen over the last several years as a more public health approach to gun violence had been instituted. Oh, I don't think I put my slide in about Congress. So just to talk about Congress really quickly, they haven't done much this year, to be perfectly honest. As you all know, we're currently in the midst of a government shutdown, which I think is just it's very kind of apropos, right? Like they've really just kind of failed in their responsibilities when it comes to, directing how our taxpayer dollars are spent. The one significant congressional action I will highlight is passage of H.R. 1. I refuse to call it by its official name. I will call it the One Big Ugly Bill. That bill did a whole bunch of terrible things, but one of the things that I will highlight as it relates to CVI are the cuts to Medicaid. So, Medicaid is the single largest insurance payer for victims of gun violence. And, the cuts to Medicaid can have really, really significant impact. So, one, reducing coverage for people who are injured by gun violence. The second has to do with hospital-based violence intervention programs. So over the past several years, 8 states have passed laws that says violence prevention professionals who, go through a certification and are essentially accredited, the work that they do in hospitals and the services they provide can be reimbursed by Medicaid. So again, 8 states have passed laws to allow this to happen. And of those 8 states that have passed laws, they're in various states, various states when it comes to implementation of actually getting that benefit up and running and making sure that violence prevention professionals are able to, file their reimbursement. There's, a whole lot of paperwork and kind of bureaucratic red tape that happens between passage of the law and actually, making those reimbursements available to organizations. So one of the things that we're concerned about as Medicaid is squeezed by the passage of HR 1 is that people will lose their health insurance, that hospital-based violence intervention programs will no longer be able to have their work reimbursed by Medicaid, and that ultimately it's going to have a really devastating impact on state budgets as a whole. Medicaid is one of the biggest, well, sources of income is a little bit funny, but it's a huge kind of program between the federal government and states. And the loss of that funding would really cause state budgets to be squeezed and potentially make it more difficult for states to, pass legislation that essentially has a cost to it. So it may make it difficult for states to choose to, invest in CVI or, kind of other new approaches to gun violence prevention because of this financial squeeze that will come from these Medicaid cuts. So that was the last thing that I wanted to highlight as far as congressional action. So I know that was a lot. I will stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions. Oh, I think you are muted.
Yes, thank you very much. I would, first of all, like to say thank you so much. And you may tell your father that you are a good professor. You know your material and you can
Oh, thank
communicate
you.
it so persuasively. That was broad and deep and compelling and disturbing information, although very exciting to hear about the cities you highlighted in the areas of the country that under CVI good times were showing such remarkable progress. And hopefully we can build on those. We do have some questions that I'd like to pose to you. And I am going to, oh, here's a comment, very informative. I'm going to go right back to sort of the first question and go in order. In your experience, Adzi, what are the biggest challenges in engaging community members, victims, families, organization, community orgs in research initiated by academic researchers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a couple of things. One is just trust, right? When you're asking people to talk about, one of the most painful experiences in their life, there's always concern about being exploited. So I think, if especially if a researcher doesn't necessarily come from community, there's just potentially a lack of trust. I think another thing that's challenging is sometimes the design of studies. And, I think about this as someone who is an advocate. When we're talking to elected officials, especially members of Congress, they always want to know, like, what is the data saying that this works? How can we prove that this is effective? And some of those measures, I think, don't necessarily get at the full impact of the community. And so when we talk about, well, we've seen, with this investment, homicides reduced by XYZ percentage, I think for community members who are still impacted, that's really challenging for them because of course, it is important that when we look year over year, we do see those reductions in violence. But I think it's challenging for researchers to capture the full scope of impact. And I think sometimes that can lead to people not wanting to engage and kind of share their stories with researchers.
Great. Thank you. Another question comes from Maureen, who is, I said, a member of our communications committee. Is there growing concern with potential violence related to the trauma around the country of impacts related to the loss of federal funding and support of basic aid programs, food, safety, housing, schools? So, should we, need we anticipate an increase in violence because of the changes to these, as you say, protective factors?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say this, but it feels like, we're kind of in a perfect storm of the conditions that violence. With the government being shut down, so many workers, not having an income right now, the food, housing, and insecurity that kind of comes from that. We know that we're in a very tense political environment, right? We know that there have been some really high profile incidents of violence, and so I feel like we are in a moment where the conditions are ripe for violence. So I really hope that I'm wrong, but this is exactly the kind of perfect storm for creating violence in communities. So yeah, definitely very much concerned about that.
I share your concern, and I think most of us probably do. Perfect storm is a perfect phrase to capture, where we are. Dorothy would like to just comment that she wants to underscore the interest in your experience and challenges around community engagement, the trust building factor, the need to have people known and trusted by the community as the messengers and the carriers of work. I'm going to go back to your other question, Kay, in just a second. But you mentioned we will need to wait for data to determine the impact of current practices. Do you think we will have accurate data in the future?
Oof, that is a very good point. I worry about that. Some of the things that we're seeing, especially at the federal level, it was such a hard one fight. I was working at Giffords when we finally got Congress to start funding gun violence research again, back in 2019, and you know, it's hard to trust a lot of the information that's coming out of the Department of Health and Human Services, and with both the elimination of the experts. So maybe elimination is the firing, I guess, of the experts who studied these things, as well as a lack of funding to do so. It is really concerning. And I don't know that we'll have accurate information and information that we can trust. It's very sad to say that about our federal government, but I do think that is the reality. In the absence of federal funding for gun violence research for so long, we had a lot of different um, academic institutions, stepping up to try to do what they can in their respective states. Centers for Gun Violence Research, New Jersey comes to mind as a state that really did a lot in that respect. So, hopefully we'll still see some information come out of those institutions. I think, I don't know that we'll be able to count on having accurate data from this federal government under this administration.
Hmm. Along with the Center New Jersey that you reference is stepping up, I just want to pitch the fact that Grandmothers Against Gun Violence in Washington State, the foundation, has been stepping up and funding research for a number of years now. And we're just finishing a study we funded on gun violence among rural youth and coming up with some important data and patterns there. So the foundation is going to continue its work. If anybody wants to learn more about it, Foundation Grandmothers Against Gun Violence.org. The national organization, which is what we are now, Grandmothers for Gun Responsibility, is also going to pick up this work and be at least put out calls for people to step up to fund research. We need the data. We need the evidence to know what are the best policies, what are the best strategies, what can we do? Yeah, for sure. Okay, comment, brilliant presentation.
Oh,
I,
thank you.
I would definitely agree with that. And then back to a question from Kay. What are the best ways individual or groups of citizens can push back against the threats to public health approaches to prevention?
Well, I think the fight is at the state and local level. I think that we have to accept the unfortunate reality that the federal government is not on our side when it comes to this issue. But we want to make sure that, states and municipalities are doing their part to invest what they can in this work. That was already kind of a concern when we think about, the investment of ARPA dollars. Those dollars were temporary for just a short amount of time. So there was already a need for states and cities to think about how they replace those funds from their own budgets. I think it's even more important now than ever. I saw a question here about reporting in the trace. I think that was today or yesterday, about the downward trend in violence in a lot of cities. That is true. That's what we are seeing statistically, that, because of these investments that started, back in 2021, since 2022, we are seeing downward trends in most major cities across the country. So hopefully, that downward trend will inspire elected officials to continue making these investments, and doing these things that have been shown to be successful over the last few years. is to find the funds and to fund the initiatives that have been effective are important. We still have a long ways to go. I mean, I think any gun death is unacceptable. But we if we're seeing that something is working, that's what we need to continue doing. We don't need to go to a different approach.
Great. Thank you. Uh, Here in Seattle, where many of us are actually, King County is our county, we are actually beginning to work as an organization on our local level too, to support um, this kind of work locally. Because you're right, that's where the opportunities largely are now and where the most direct and immediate impact is as well. Comment from someone that is agreeing that prevention, putting funding into the front end of things, is common sense and is a good strategy. And then for our final question, before I thank you and we say goodbye, a question from a member of our board, Cheryl, are there implications from this situation for the midterms? Can communities be mobilized to fight?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely. I think in the last several elections, we see that crime and violence and perceptions of increases in crime and violence continue to be something that people think about when they're at the polls, right? And so, as we're seeing, I don't know a better word to use other than like this crazy kind of deployment of military and federal law enforcement in this very ineffective way. I think I'm hopeful that, in the midterms, people will be willing to keep that in mind when they're voting. I think we have to continue to message and talk about the importance of prevention and intervention, and thinking about this issue like the public health issue that it is. Unfortunately, I think the other side has done a much better job than ours has when it comes to the messaging and kind of the emotional messaging around concerns about crime and violence. So we certainly have some work to do over the next year to make sure that, as this continues to be an issue that drives people to the polls, they're thinking about it in a way that will be productive and effective for all of us.
Great, thank you. I've just decided that in the next No Kings March, my sign is going to say support CVI. That's what I'm going
Oh, great.
to That's what I'm going to say. Adzi, thank you so much. This has been hugely informative. I feel like we've all probably learned a lot and feel deeply more acquainted with CVI and your great work. And I would like you to know that Grandmothers for Gun Responsibility is here, available, growing, and eager to connect with you and community justice and this work and to be part of the team
Oh,
continuing
well,
this.
thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you. I
Adzi.